Help!
Zubaida knelt on the freezing steel floor of the service elevator,
Please help!
her knees absorbing the relentless, mechanical vibrations of the Eagle Crest estate basement generators. The air in the 3x3 metal box was a suffocating, heavy blend of stale diesel fuel, ancient rust, and the sour ghost of fermented cassava left behind by the kitchen staff hours earlier. She did not scream, she did not beg. She had learned, over the 7 months she had lived under Sylvester's roof as his wife in name only, that screaming only provided him with the exact currency he desired. Above her, filtering down through the grease-stained vents of the elevator shaft, she could hear the delicate, sweeping notes of a live string quartet and the bright, expensive sound of crystal champagne flutes meeting in toasts. What Sylvester did not know, what he could not have possibly comprehended as he violently pulled the iron grate shut 3 hours earlier, was that the woman shivering in the dark was the sole legal heir to the Obiora fortune. Zubaida was not a destitute charity case brought in from the streets of Dar es Salaam to massage his mother's public image. She was the owner of the very ground his Italian leather shoes were currently pacing upon. Tucked deeply inside the pocket of her faded, threadbare cotton dress was a notarized mandate from the parent board of Zenith Global Industries, bearing a single signature that could reduce Sylvester's entire corporate empire to a pile of ash by the morning. The physical reality of the service elevator was a testament to the invisible, grinding labor that kept Sylvester's world turning. The metal walls were slick with condensation and the grime of 1,000 unspoken errands. It was a space designed for cargo, for the heavy sacks of flour and the bleeding cuts of raw meat, not for a human being. The cold bit through the thin fabric of Zubaida's dress, settling deep into her joints until her fingers grew stiff and unresponsive. Yet, she kept her posture completely rigid. She pressed her spine against the freezing steel, turning her breathing into a slow, measured rhythm. Her heartbeat moved into her ears, a steady, thrumming drum that served as her only clock in the pitch-black space. She closed her eyes and allowed the stark contrast of her environment to wash over her. 3 floors above, the Eagle Crest Executive Gala was in full motion, a monument to excess and manufactured grace. The air up there was scrubbed clean by industrial purifiers, heavily scented with the floral sweetness of fresh-cut orchids and the sharp, imposing bite of expensive imported cologne. Sylvester was moving through the grand ballroom, his smile wide and completely empty, offering his hand to shipping magnates and regional politicians. Bernice, his mother, was seated at the head of the primary dining table, her neck draped in heavy emeralds that caught the light of the crystal chandeliers. They were feasting on rare-cooked steak points and buttery pastries, entirely insulated from the consequences of their own cruelty. They believed that wealth was a permanent shield, a divine right that separated them from the dirt of the earth. They did not realize that they were merely tenants in a house owned by the woman they had locked in the basement. The memory of how she had ended up in the metal cage replayed in Zubaida's mind with forensic clarity. It had happened just before the first guests arrived. Zubaida had been instructed to remain in the damp, windowless room behind the kitchen, out of sight and out of mind. But she had needed water. She had stepped briefly into the secondary hallway, her faded cotton dress a stark violation of the evening's aesthetic. Sylvester had rounded the corner, his bespoke suit immaculate, his eyes instantly darkening with an irrational, explosive fury at the sight of her. He had grabbed her by the upper arm, his fingers digging into her flesh with enough force to leave deep, purple bruises that would take weeks to fade. He had dragged her down the service corridor, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper. "You do not belong on this floor," he had hissed, shoving her violently into the open service elevator. "Look at you. You look like you just crawled out of a gutter. You are a decoration, Zubaida, and tonight the theme is excellence. I will not have my partners looking at a nameless, penniless orphan and wondering why I stooped so low. Stay in the dark, where you belong." He had slammed the heavy iron grate shut and pulled the master override switch, severing the power to the carriage and leaving her suspended between floors. The words had not wounded her in the way he intended. They landed instead on an older, far more calloused bruise. They echoed the voices of the orphanage matrons from 20 years ago, women who had constantly reminded her that children without bloodlines were merely liabilities taking up space. Sylvester believed that by attacking her lack of pedigree, he was asserting his dominance, reminding her that she existed entirely at his mercy. He needed her to be weak. He required her total dependence to validate his own fragile sense of superiority. What he failed to understand was that a woman who has survived the absolute bottom of the world cannot be threatened with the dark. She was born in it. Her silence in the face of his aggression was not submission. It was the meticulous gathering of data. Every insult he threw at her was logged, every physical assault documented in the quiet architecture of her mind. He was handing her the exact tools she would eventually use to dismantle him. Some men build their own prisons, but Sylvester was going a step further. He was polishing the bars. The hours dragged on, the temperature inside the metal box continuing to drop. Zubaida shifted her weight, the rusted bolts of the floor pressing painfully into her knees. Her stomach cramped with a sharp, hollow ache, a reminder that she had not been allowed to eat since the morning. She thought of Ozoemena, the chief legal counsel for the Obiora Trust, sitting in his immaculate office miles away. He was waiting for her signal. He was the only person in Dar es Salaam who knew the truth of her lineage. Her grandfather, a man of terrifying intellect and vast wealth, had suspected that the executives running his subsidiary branches were corrupt. He had mandated in his will that Zubaida must observe them from the bottom before taking her seat at the top. She had chosen Sylvester's household specifically because his financial reports had looked too perfect, too sanitized. She had come to find a thief, but she had uncovered a monster. She allowed herself to picture the document sitting in her pocket. It was a beautiful piece of legal machinery. It did not require a lengthy court battle. It did not require debate. It only required her signature to activate a total asset freeze on everything Sylvester claimed to own. She could end her suffering in a single evening. She could scream for the maintenance crew, demand to be released, and walk into the ballroom to strip him of his title in front of his peers right now. But she did not. Premature execution ruins the lesson. She needed him to commit entirely to his own hubris. She needed the audience of his downfall to be absolute. She breathed in the smell of diesel and rust, converting the sensory discomfort into patience. Suddenly, the heavy steel cables above her groaned in the darkness. The mechanical whine of the pulley system re-engaged, sending a violent shudder through the metal box. The elevator jerked upward, the sudden movement throwing Zubaida against the cold wall. She caught herself, her hands slapping flat against the steel. The carriage rose slowly, the sound of the string quartet growing louder, shifting from a muffled vibration to a clear, sweeping melody. The gala was winding down. The guests were likely departing, their bellies full of rich food, and their minds completely devoid of any thought regarding the people who served them. The elevator shuddered to a harsh halt at the ground floor. The master lock clicked heavily, and the iron grate was violently shoved open. The blinding, artificial light of the service hallway flooded into the small box, forcing Zubaida to squint. Standing in the doorway, blocking the light, was Sylvester. He had loosened his expensive silk tie, and his breath carried the heavy, unmistakable scent of aged cognac. He looked down at her, his expression a mixture of deep disgust and exhausted irritation, as if her mere existence was a chore he was tired of managing. He did not offer his hand to help her up. He did not ask if she was freezing. He simply leaned against the doorframe and crossed his arms. "The guests are gone," Sylvester said, his voice entirely devoid of warmth. "You can come out now. Go to the kitchen and help the staff scrub the pots. And do not let me catch you near the main staircase. I have already spent enough time tonight trying to forget that I am tied to a woman who smells like a public market." Zubaida pulled herself to her feet. Her joints screamed in protest, stiff and aching from 3 hours of immobility in the damp cold. Her throat tightened until swallowing felt like forcing down a stone, a painful, restrictive block in her airway. Her jaw locked so firmly that her teeth ground together. But she did not shed a tear. The physical sensation of her own distress was pushed down, compacted, and stored away. She stepped out of the elevator, moving past him without lowering her head. She did not raise her voice. She did not argue. "I know," she said quietly, her voice barely carrying over the hum of the nearby generators. Sylvester sneered, turning his back on her as he walked toward the main house, entirely satisfied that he had reminded the orphan of her place in the dirt. He walked away believing he was a king returning to his throne, completely unaware that he had just turned his back on the executioner. The weeks that followed the executive gala settled into a rhythm of sustained, meticulous cruelty. Sylvester and his mother did not rely on loud, explosive arguments to break Zubaida. They understood that true degradation is a slow, quiet grinding of a person's spirit. The Eagle Crest estate became a meticulously designed theater where Zubaida's isolation was placed on daily display. Her existence was stripped of all marital dignity, reduced to the physical labor that kept the mansion immaculate. While Sylvester and Bernice moved through hallways smelling of lavender polish and chilled eucalyptus, Zubaida's world was defined by the sharp, chemical sting of industrial bleach, the rough texture of scrubbing brushes, and the heavy, humid air of the outdoor laundry courtyard. On a Tuesday afternoon, the oppressive heat of Dar es Salaam was locked outside the estate's thick glass windows. Inside, the air conditioning hummed a low, expensive note. Bernice had summoned Zubaida to the secondary dining room. When Zubaida arrived, wiping the moisture of dishwater from her bare hands, Bernice was standing beside a silver tray. On the tray lay a folded pile of stiff, black and white cotton. It was the standard uniform worn by the lowest tier of the estate's catering staff. "Put it on," Bernice commanded, her voice carrying the smooth, indifferent weight of inherited authority. She did not bother to look Zubaida in the eye, focusing instead on adjusting a diamond ring on her index finger. "Sylvester is hosting an afternoon tea for Vivian. I will not have his former partner looking at you in your pathetic, faded rags and wondering if my son has started running a charity for the local slums. You will serve the tea, you will keep your eyes on the floor, and you will not speak unless spoken to. People of your class are meant to be invisible." A cold knot tightened at the base of Zubaida's throat, her pulse beating a slow, heavy rhythm against her collarbone. Heat climbed faintly into the back of her neck, but her jaw remained locked. She looked at the stiff fabric, smelling faintly of harsh detergent and subservience. She did not argue. She picked up the uniform and walked to the small utility closet to change. An hour later, Zubaida stood in the corner of the grand parlor, the stiff collar of the uniform scratching uncomfortably against her neck. The room was a sanctuary of wealth, filled with the scent of imported Earl Grey tea and the soft, buttery smell of freshly baked scones. Vivian, a socialite draped in silk that caught the afternoon light with every movement, sat close to Sylvester on the velvet sofa. Vivian's wrists were heavy with clinking gold bangles, the sound ringing through the room like small, mocking bells. Zubaida stepped forward, her footsteps completely silent on the thick Persian rug, and lowered the heavy silver tray onto the marble coffee table. "It is so difficult to find competent help these days," Vivian remarked, leaning back and running a manicured hand through her hair. She looked directly at Zubaida, her eyes raking over the uniform with practiced disdain. "Especially when you pull them straight from the dirt. You really must be careful, Bernice. Girls with no family background are prone to stealing. When you have no pedigree, you have no morals." Bernice let out a soft, elegant laugh, bringing her porcelain teacup to her lips. "Oh, we keep a very close eye on the inventory, my dear. She is only here because my son has a terrible habit of bringing home strays." Zubaida did not flinch. Her hands remained steady as she poured the hot tea, not spilling a single drop. She poured the liquid with the exact precision of a woman who knew she was serving poison to ghosts. They believed they were humiliating her by forcing her to play the servant, completely unaware that she had spent her entire life studying how invisible people moved through rooms of power. To be ignored was to be unmonitored. Bernice and Vivian thought they were establishing a hierarchy. They were actually providing a master strategist with the ultimate camouflage. Zubaida stepped back into the shadows of the corner, her breathing slow and measured, logging every insult into the silent architecture of her mind. The cruelty escalated 3 days later inside the cavernous walls of Sylvester's private study. Zubaida had been ordered to quietly organize the massive oak bookshelves, while Sylvester held a meeting with Pascal, a junior corporate attorney for Eagle Crest. The room smelled of old leather bindings and the sharp tang of expensive ink. Pascal was reviewing a stack of asset protection documents, his pen hovering over a clause regarding marital property rights. "Sir, if I may ask," Pascal began, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "In the event of a corporate restructuring, have you considered the legal leverage your wife might attempt to utilize? Spousal severance can be incredibly complicated." Sylvester leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, a smirk pulling at the corner of his mouth. He looked across the room at Zubaida, who was dusting the lower shelves, her back turned to them. He did not lower his voice. He wanted her to hear. "Leverage requires a foundation, Pascal," Sylvester said, his tone dripping with casual venom. "Look at her. Her mother was a nobody who died in a charity ward. She was raised by the state. She has no brothers to come knocking on my door, no uncles to demand a settlement, and no family name to protect. She has no one. That is not a tragedy, that is a convenience. When I am finished with her, she will walk out of those gates with exactly what she brought into them. Nothing." The words left Sylvester's lips with the heavy, absolute certainty of a man who believed he controlled the universe. But the words did not wound Zubaida in the way he intended. They landed instead on an older memory, a conversation she had shared with her adoptive father, the late Obiora patriarch, just weeks before his death. He had sat in his hospital bed, his breathing frail, and told her that the greatest weapon a leader could possess was the enemy's false sense of security. "Let them think you are alone," he had whispered. "Let them think you are weak. A fortress is only attacked when it looks like a fortress." Sylvester believed her isolation was a fatal vulnerability. He did not understand that a woman with no attachments was a woman with nothing left to lose, and therefore nothing left to fear. By isolating her entirely, Sylvester had inadvertently removed every piece of leverage he might have used against her in the coming war. He was meticulously digging his own grave, measuring the depth with his own insults. Some doors open because you push them. Others open because the house is already on fire. Zubaida wiped a layer of dust from a leather-bound encyclopedia. Her chest rose and fell in a perfectly even rhythm. She did not turn around. She did not defend her humanity. She simply allowed him to believe his own lies, because it cost her nothing to be patient, and it was about to cost him everything to be wrong. By the end of the 3rd week, the physical toll of her imposed servitude had settled deeply into Zubaida's bones, but the ultimate violation of her dignity was yet to arrive. It happened on a Thursday morning, heavy with the threat of rain, inside the cavernous, air-conditioned sanctuary of Sylvester's private study. Zubaida had been ordered to deep clean the towering oak bookshelves and polish the glass display cabinets. Tucked into the deep pocket of her apron was a small, fragile item, a frayed, leather-bound volume of ancient Swahili poetry. It was the only physical object in the world that had belonged to her biological mother, a woman who had passed away when Zubaida was an infant. The pages were yellowed and brittle, smelling faintly of distant wood smoke and dried earth. It was a scent that completely defied the sharp, artificial bite of the expensive lemon polish Zubaida was currently applying to Sylvester's massive mahogany desk. Needing both hands to reach the highest shelf of the glass cabinet, Zubaida carefully removed the small book from her apron and set it down on the very edge of the desk, inches away from a solid gold paperweight. It was meant to rest there for only a minute. The heavy double doors swung open without warning. Sylvester walked in, his phone pressed to his ear, his Italian leather shoes making sharp, authoritative sounds against the hardwood floor. He ended his call mid-sentence. His eyes instantly locked onto the worn, cracked leather of the small book resting on his pristine workspace. He reached out and picked it up, holding it between two fingers as if the ancient cover were coated in a contagious disease. "What is this rubbish doing in my office?" Sylvester demanded, turning the delicate pages with rough, careless hands. Zubaida stepped down from the small wooden ladder. She kept her hands at her sides. "It is mine," she said quietly. "Please give it back." Sylvester scoffed, a short, ugly sound that echoed off the high ceiling. "Your mother was a street hawker who died with absolutely nothing to her name," he snarled, his voice rising in volume. "And you are exactly like her. What made you think you could elevate yourself by bringing your poverty into my sanctuary? People like you do not leave your trash on my desk." Before Zubaida could take a step forward, Sylvester gripped the front and back covers in his large hands and pulled in opposite directions. The dry, century-old binding gave way with a sickening crack. The thick paper tore straight down the spine. Sylvester dropped the two ruined halves onto the Persian rug at his feet, the loose, yellowed pages fluttering down like dead autumn leaves. "Trash belongs in the bin," he said, turning his back to her. "Clean it up." Her lungs instantly forgot how to pull in air. A freezing numbness spread from her collarbone down to her fingertips, heavy and absolute. The blood pounded in her ears so loudly it drowned out the hum of the air conditioning. She looked down at the torn pages scattered across the expensive wool rug, and then up at the broad shoulders of the man who had just casually destroyed the only piece of her history she had left. She did not fall to her knees. She did not scream. Her jaw locked with such force that her teeth ground together. "I know," Zubaida said, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried absolutely no warmth. The tearing of the paper had sounded like a small bone snapping, and in many ways it was. Sylvester believed he had just broken her spirit, severing the final pathetic tie to a past she desperately cherished. He needed her unmoored, completely adrift and dependent on his ocean of power to survive. What he had actually done, in his blind arrogance, was sever the final thread of mercy she might have held for him. A woman grieving her mother is a tragedy. A woman who has finished grieving is a weapon. He had wanted to remind her that she owned nothing in his world. He had only reminded her that he was breathing borrowed air. The clock on his empire had just run out. Zubaida knelt on the expensive Persian rug, the rough fibers pressing into her bare knees as she meticulously gathered the torn pages of her mother's poetry book. She did not rush. Her hands did not shake. She picked up each yellowed, brittle fragment with the reverence of an archaeologist unearthing a sacred artifact, sliding them silently into the deep pocket of her bleach-scented apron. The physical destruction of the book was complete, but the emotional devastation Sylvester had anticipated never materialized. Her throat was dry, and a cold, absolute certainty had settled heavily behind her ribs, replacing the last lingering traces of passive endurance. She stood up, smoothing the front of her uniform. She did not look back at the desk where the destruction had occurred. The time for mourning the past had officially concluded. The time for auditing the present had begun. That night, long after the house had gone quiet and the heavy mahogany doors of the master suites had been locked from the inside, Zubaida walked back down the darkened corridors of the Eagle Crest estate. The air conditioning had been lowered for the evening, leaving the hallways smelling faintly of chilled eucalyptus and the lingering sharp scent of Sylvester's imported cologne. Outside the thick, bulletproof windows, the distant, rhythmic crashing of the Indian Ocean against the Dar es Salaam coastline provided a steady, unrelenting bass note. Zubaida moved like a shadow, her bare feet making absolutely no sound against the cold marble floors. She bypassed the kitchen and the service quarters, moving directly toward the cavernous space of Sylvester's private study. The heavy oak doors were closed but not locked. Sylvester never locked his study when he was inside the estate. He believed that the psychological barrier of his authority was enough to keep the servants out, and he viewed his wife as nothing more than the lowest-ranking member of that staff. He operated under the fatal assumption that poverty equated to illiteracy, and that a woman who spent her days scrubbing patio tiles could not possibly comprehend the complex architecture of corporate finance. It was an arrogance born of immense privilege, and it was the exact vulnerability Zubaida required. She pushed the door open just enough to slip inside. The study was a sanctuary of wealth, filled with the scent of old leather bindings, stale cognac, and the metallic tang of the massive, state-of-the-art wall safe. The safe itself was secured with a biometric scanner, but Zubaida did not need to open it. Sylvester's arrogance extended to his desk habits, spread across the polished expanse of the mahogany desk, illuminated only by the pale moonlight spilling through the floor-to-ceiling windows, were the physical ledgers and printed asset transfer reports he had been reviewing earlier with his junior attorney. Zubaida stepped up to the desk. She did not turn on the brass reading lamp. Her eyes had long since adjusted to the dark. She leaned over the documents, her breathing slowing to a measured, deliberate crawl. Her eyes scanned the columns of numbers, the routing codes, and the signatures authorizing massive withdrawals. She read the names of 3 different shell companies registered in offshore territories. She traced the flow of capital, watching how funds intended for the operational budget of Eaglecrest Industries were being systematically siphoned away into private accounts held solely in Sylvester's name. He was bleeding the company dry, inflating operational costs and masking the deficit behind layers of convoluted legal jargon. She picked up a quarterly summary report, the heavy, expensive paper crisp between her calloused fingers. If Sylvester had bothered to read the document he had locked away in his safe, he would have recognized the patterns of a standard corporate audit. But what Sylvester could not have known, and what he would not discover until it was entirely too late, was that the money he was so meticulously stealing did not belong to a faceless board of directors. It belonged to her. Deep inside the underground vault of the Central Bank of Dar es Salaam, resting in a temperature-controlled steel lockbox, was the final will and testament of the Obiora patriarch. The document stipulated that total ownership of Zenith Global Industries and all its subsidiaries, including Eaglecrest, would transfer to his sole granddaughter on her 30th birthday. Zubaida was exactly 21 days away from turning 30. Sylvester believed he was skimming millions from an agonizing corporate monolith, completely oblivious to the fact that he was actively robbing the quiet, destitute orphan who was currently standing in his office, memorizing his account numbers in the dark. Zubaida placed the quarterly report exactly where she had found it, ensuring it aligned perfectly with the edge of the gold paperweight. She did not feel a sense of betrayal at his theft. Betrayal requires trust, and she had never trusted him. What she felt was the cold, sterile satisfaction of a pathologist finding the exact cause of death. A thief who steals from the master while the master is out of the house is a common criminal. But a thief who steals from the master while the master stands quietly behind him, watching his hands, is a fool actively building his own gallows. Sylvester had handed her the final piece of evidence required not just to divorce him, but to annihilate him. She stepped back from the desk, her expression completely blank in the moonlight. She did not need to steal the papers. She had a photographic memory, honed by a decade of organizing the vast archives of the city library. She committed the offshore routing numbers to memory, repeating the sequence of digits in her mind until they were carved into her consciousness alongside the memory of his insults. She walked out of the study, pulling the heavy oak doors shut with a soft, imperceptible click. The estate was entirely silent, the occupants sleeping soundly in their luxury suites, insulated by their stolen wealth. Zubaida walked back to her damp, windowless room behind the kitchen. She lay down on her thin mattress, pulling the coarse, scratchy blanket up to her chin. Sleep did not come easily, but she did not toss and turn. She lay perfectly still, staring at the ceiling, the machinery of her reclamation silently turning its gears. The gathering of data was complete. The execution phase was approaching, and she needed to contact the one man in the city who could forge the weapon she was about to wield. 2 days later, an opportunity presented itself. Bernice sent Zubaida to the Kariakou market to purchase specific medicinal roots, a task deemed too filthy for the regular drivers because it required walking through the muddy, crowded stalls of the inner city. Zubaida stepped out of the heavy iron gates of the Eagle Crest estate and into the punishing midday heat of Dar es Salaam. The air immediately thickened, smelling fiercely of vehicle exhaust, roasting maize, and the metallic tang of the nearby harbor. She walked past the aggressive blare of Okada horns and the shouts of street hawkers selling brightly colored Ankara fabric. Her cheap, thin sandals slapped against the cracked, uneven asphalt, a stark contrast to the plush, silent wool carpets she had just left behind. She did not go to the market. She walked 3 miles through the dense, chaotic arteries of the city until she reached the towering, reflective glass facade of the Zenith Global Industries headquarters. She bypassed the grand main entrance with its spinning revolving doors and polished marble fountains. Instead, she slipped into a narrow service alley, her thumb pressing against a biometric scanner hidden entirely from street view beneath a rusted electrical box. The scanner glowed a soft green. A heavy steel door clicked open, admitting her into a private, unmonitored elevator. The ascent was completely soundless, instantly erasing the chaotic noise and oppressive heat of the streets below. When the doors parted, the air was aggressively chilled, smelling of expensive ozone purifiers, fresh ink, and old paper. She stepped out onto the 42nd floor, a sanctuary of extreme corporate wealth that existed entirely isolated from the reality of the city below. Behind a desk carved from a single slab of imported black marble sat Ozo Amena, the chief legal counsel for the Obiora Trust. He wore a suit cut from dark, heavy wool, his silver hair cropped close to his scalp. He was a man who traded in corporate executions and legal warfare, a man who rarely stood up for anyone. But when Zubaida walked into the room, he pushed his heavy chair back and stood up immediately. He did not look at her faded cotton dress. He did not look at the layer of street dust coating her cheap sandals. He looked directly at her eyes, recognizing the exact, unyielding stillness of the man who had built the empire they were currently standing in. "It is time, Ozo Amena," Zubaida said softly, her voice carrying no echo in the heavily carpeted room. Ozo Amena bowed his head slightly. He slid a thick, black leather folio across the polished marble. The words did not need to be loud to carry the weight of an avalanche. Ozo Amena had spent the last 7 months watching Sylvester parade around the city like a conquering king, waiting patiently for the true heir to complete her grandfather's final test. He had watched the abuse from a distance, bound by his solemn oath to the late patriarch not to intervene until Zubaida herself gave the command. The quiet statement she had just issued was not a request for rescue from a victim. It was the authorization of a tactical strike from a commander. The waiting period, a suffocating era of forced passivity for the old lawyer, was finally over. Sylvester has established 3 shell companies in offshore territories, Zubaida continued, her tone conversational, as if discussing the impending weather. She recited the 12-digit routing numbers entirely from memory, her voice never wavering or rushing. He is inflating the operational costs of the Eagle Crest Logistics Division and siphoning the surplus. He believes the parent company is a bloated, blind machine that will not notice a few million missing from the annual budget. Ozo Amena picked up a silver fountain pen, unscrewing the cap with a smooth, practiced motion. "The arrogance of the thief is always his greatest liability," the lawyer said quietly. "He steals from the treasury while standing directly under the surveillance cameras, believing he is invisible simply because he is wearing an expensive suit. He opened the heavy black folio. Inside lay a stack of documents printed on thick, watermarked paper. These were the transfer deeds, the immediate termination notices, and the absolute foreclosure orders on all assets currently held in Sylvester's name. The trap had been painstakingly constructed over months. It only lacked the physical mechanism to snap it shut. If you sign these today, the legal transfer of power will activate automatically on the morning of your 30th birthday, Zubaida explained, placing the pen on top of the documents. The board of directors has been quietly aligned. The banks have been notified of a pending executive shift. When the clock strikes midnight on Friday, Sylvester will not even own the leather chair he sits on. Zubaida reached for the silver pen. The metal was cold against her calloused fingers. She did not hesitate. Her chest rose and fell in a steady, unbroken rhythm. She pressed the nib to the paper, the scratch of the ink loud in the pristine silence of the office. She signed her name, abandoning the false identity of a destitute orphan and legally reclaiming the Obiora bloodline. She signed the foreclosure order on the Dar es Salaam estate. She signed the immediate termination of Sylvester's position as chief executive officer of the subsidiary branch. The scratch of the pen was a small, seemingly insignificant sound, but it represented the total, systematic dismantling of a man's life. Sylvester believed that power was loud. He believed it was the sound of a fist hitting a mahogany table, or a harsh voice raised in anger across a crowded room. He did not understand that true, catastrophic power is almost always silent. It is the sound of ink drying on a page. It is the quiet hum of a wire transfer moving millions of dollars across an ocean in the middle of the night. By equating volume with authority, Sylvester had rendered himself completely deaf to the sounds of his own impending destruction. Friday evening is the annual shareholders' gala at the Grand Kilimanjaro Hotel, Zubaida stated, placing the pen back on the marble desk and closing the folio. He intends to announce a permanent merger with Vivian's father. He plans to introduce her as the new vice chairwoman of the board. Zubaida pulled the heavy leather folio toward his side of the desk. "Then Friday evening is when we will attend," he replied. Zubaida returned to the Eagle Crest estate just as the afternoon sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns. She carried a rough burlap sack filled with the bitter, earthy-smelling medicinal roots Bernice had demanded. She handed the sack to the head cook without a word and retreated to the laundry courtyard. The air here was thick with the oppressive heat of boiling water, hot starch, and damp wool. As she picked up the heavy iron to press Sylvester's evening tuxedo, a young maid named Neka walked past carrying a basket of folded linens. Neka did not speak, but she offered Zubaida a single, almost imperceptible nod before disappearing down the corridor. What Sylvester and Bernice firmly believed was that their financial secrets were perfectly insulated. Bernice kept a secondary, physical ledger of their offshore diversions locked in a biometric safe inside her private boudoir, certain that electronic firewalls could be breached, but physical paper under her own roof was untouchable. What they completely failed to realize was that walls only protect you from the outside. Zubaida had not needed to crack a safe or hire corporate spies. She had simply utilized the network of invisible women who scrubbed the estate's floors, emptied its wastebaskets, and dusted its biometric safes. Every Tuesday afternoon, while Bernice sat on the terrace drinking gin, Neka cleaned the boudoir. Armed with a micro-lens camera provided by Zubaida, Neka had systematically photographed every page of that physical ledger over the course of 3 months. The wealthy often treat their domestic staff as walking furniture, assuming that those who clean the dirt are not intelligent enough to read the documents they dust. By rendering the maids socially invisible, Bernice had inadvertently built the exact surveillance apparatus that was currently dismantling her son's empire. The heavy wooden door of the laundry courtyard swung open, breaking the humid silence. Sylvester stepped in, already dressed in his crisp white undershirt and tailored black trousers. The room smelled of harsh chemical starch and sweat, a stark contrast to the expensive sandalwood aftershave radiating from his skin. He looked at Zubaida, his expression twisting into a familiar mask of absolute contempt. He did not see a wife, nor did he see a human being. He saw a temporary stain on his pristine life that he was finally preparing to bleach away entirely. "Make sure the lapels are perfectly pressed," Sylvester commanded, his voice sharp and demanding. "I will be standing in front of 300 of the most influential partners in East Africa tonight. I cannot have them looking at a wrinkled jacket and assuming my household is managed by an incompetent street beggar." Zubaida did not look up from the ironing board. She guided the hot metal over the dark fabric, the steam hissing loudly as it met the starch. "I understand," she said evenly, her voice betraying absolutely nothing. Bernice walked into the room a moment later, holding a crystal glass of sparkling water. She looked at Zubaida, then turned her attention to her son. "The arrangements are complete, Sylvester," she said, her tone light and conversational. "Vivian and her father will arrive at the hotel an hour early for the private reception. Once you make the announcement, security has been instructed to lock the estate gates." Sylvester smiled, a cold, predatory stretching of his lips. He turned his attention back to Zubaida. "You hear that?" he asked, stepping closer to the ironing board. "You are done here. Tonight, I will introduce a woman of actual pedigree to the board. You will pack whatever pathetic, threadbare items you brought into my house, and you will be gone before I return. If you try to stay, my guards will drag you out into the street by your hair. You thought you could anchor yourself to my wealth by simply existing quietly in the corner. You thought wrong. You are nothing, Zubaida, and tonight you return to nothing." The threat was designed to induce panic, to finally break the glacial composure that had irritated him for 7 months. But the words did not trigger fear. Instead, a profound, settling stillness anchored Zubaida's chest. Her heartbeat remained a slow, unbothered metronome against her ribs. She did not plead for her marriage. She did not ask for a financial settlement. She simply continued to press the hot iron along the seam of his jacket. Sylvester believed that discarding a human being was a simple administrative task, a matter of changing the locks and issuing an order to the guards. He viewed relationships purely as transactions of leverage, and since he believed Zubaida held zero capital, he calculated the cost of her disposal at absolute zero. What he failed to comprehend was the terrifying physics of a truly cornered person. He assumed her silence was the silence of the defeated. He did not realize it was the silence of a bomb whose timer had already reached zero. Arrogance had entirely deafened him to the sound of his own approaching ruin. A man who spends his life looking down upon the world will never see the blade descending from above. Zubaida lifted the heavy tuxedo jacket, ensuring the lapels were razor sharp. She handed it to him on a wooden hanger, her hands perfectly steady. "I will be ready," she said quietly. Sylvester snatched the hanger from her grasp, offering a final, disgusted scoff before turning on his heel and walking out of the damp laundry room, his mother trailing close behind him. They were retreating to their luxurious suites to prepare for their grand coronation. They believed the gala at the Grand Kilimanjaro Hotel would be the ultimate consolidation of their power, a public crowning alongside Vivian and her father's shipping empire. Left alone in the humid, starch-scented room, Zubaida unplugged the heavy iron. She did not need to pack her bags. She did not own anything in the servant quarters that was worth keeping, and the estate itself would legally return to her possession by midnight. The Obiora mandate was already sitting in Ozo Emina's black folio, signed, sealed, and waiting in the hotel ballroom. Zubaida walked to the small utility sink and washed the grime of the market from her hands. Sylvester was putting on a tuxedo to celebrate his ascension, entirely unaware that he was dressing for his own funeral. The quiet reclamation was complete. She was fully armed. The trap was locked. All that remained was for the villain to step onto the stage. Zuide la Phasmot Cor Act Born. The reveal. Phần này tập trung miêu tả sự kiêu ngạo tột đỉnh của Sylvester tại bữa tiệc và chốt lại bằng step mot, environmental silence, trong chuỗi born step shockwave. Friday evening arrived with the heavy, suffocating humidity typical of the Dar es Salaam coast, a thick wall of heat that smelled of sea salt and distant rain. But the climate inside the grand ballroom of the Kilimanjaro Hotel had been aggressively engineered to mimic a crisp European winter. The air was heavily filtered, chilled to a sharp perfection, and scented with the overwhelming, sweet fragrance of thousands of imported white orchids cascading from the crystal chandeliers. It was a monument to excess, a room designed specifically to remind everyone inside it of their financial superiority over the world outside. Waiters in pristine white silk jackets moved silently across the polished marble floors, carrying heavy silver trays loaded with rare-cooked steak points and towering flutes of vintage French champagne. At the absolute center of this manufactured kingdom sat the head table. Bernice was draped in a gown of spun gold fabric, her neck heavy with the weight of raw emeralds that caught the chandelier light with every slight movement of her head. Beside her sat Vivian, the shipping magnate's daughter, wearing a scarlet silk dress that left a trail of expensive perfume in its wake. Vivian's father, a man whose face was perpetually hardened by decades of ruthless corporate acquisitions, sat to her right, his presence serving as a silent, heavily armed endorsement of the merger that was about to be announced. Sylvester stood near the edge of the elevated stage, a crystal glass of aged cognac resting easily in his hand. He wore the tuxedo Zubaida had pressed for him mere hours earlier. He looked out over the sea of 300 elite guests, investors, regional politicians, and corporate partners, and felt a profound, intoxicating rush of invincibility. He believed he was looking at his permanent kingdom. He equated visibility with invulnerability, operating under the fatal delusion that if enough wealthy people saw him holding the microphone, his power would permanently bind to his bloodline. He did not understand the basic architecture of gravity. The higher the pedestal a man builds for himself, the less rope the executioner requires for the drop. A delicate chime rang through the ballroom as a waiter struck a small silver triangle signaling the beginning of the formal addresses. The low hum of nut-horking and laughter gradually died down. The string quartet playing softly in the corner allowed their final chord to fade into the chilled air. Sylvester handed his cognac to a passing waiter and ascended the 3 carpeted steps to the acrylic podium. He adjusted the lapels of his tuxedo, the very lapels ironed by the woman who legally owned every thread he was wearing. He tapped the microphone. The sharp, rhythmic thud echoed across the cavernous room, demanding absolute attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sylvester began, his voice amplified, smooth, and heavily coated in practiced authority, "I want to thank you all for gathering here tonight. We are standing at the precipice of a new era for Eagle Crest Industries. For too long, our growth has been anchored by dead weight. We have allowed outdated attachments and useless charity to slow our momentum." He paused, letting his gaze sweep over the crowd before landing intentionally on Vivian. He offered her a warm, predatory smile. Vivian adjusted her posture, her chest rising in anticipation of her public coronation. In business, as in life, one must eventually recognize when an investment has failed to yield a return, Sylvester continued, his voice echoing off the marble walls. "You cut your losses. You trim the rot. You discard what no longer serves the aesthetic of success. Tonight is about elevation. I am proud to announce the restructuring of our executive board and the complete dissolution of certain prior unfortunate domestic arrangements that no longer align with the Zenith global vision." He raised a hand, gesturing toward the shipping magnate's daughter. "It is my profound honor to introduce the future of this company, my partner in every sense of the word, your new vice chairwoman." He did not get to finish her name. The heavy 12-foot solid mahogany doors at the back of the grand ballroom did not open with a polite click. They were shoved violently inward, the heavy wood striking the marble walls with a concussive boom that sounded exactly like a thunderclap. The impact caused 300 heads to turn simultaneously. The blinding flashes of the event photographer's cameras abruptly stopped. Stepping through the threshold was Ozo Emina. He did not wear a tuxedo. He wore the severe, pitch-black ceremonial robes of a senior corporate adjudicator, a garment only seen during hostile takeovers and board-level liquidations. Flanking him, moving with terrifying, synchronized precision, were 4 heavily armed private security contractors dressed in tactical corporate black, their hands resting passively but intentionally near their holstered weapons. But it was not the armed men or the severe lawyer that sucked the oxygen from the room. It was the woman walking beside them. Zubaida did not wear the faded, threadbare cotton dress of a destitute orphan. She did not wear the stiff, bleach-scented black and white uniform of a maid. She wore a tailored suit of midnight blue, cut from material so expensive it seemed to absorb the light around it. The cheap plastic sandals had been replaced by polished leather stilettos that clicked against the marble with the rhythm of a descending hammer. Her hair was pulled back into a severe, elegant crown. Her posture was as straight and unyielding as a drawn blade. She looked entirely unfamiliar, yet undeniably inevitable. Ozo Emina walked down the center aisle, the security contractors parting the sea of confused, whispering billionaires. Zubaida walked beside him. They did not rush. They did not speak a single word. They moved with the terrifying, glacial patience of an avalanche that had already begun to slide. They reached the front of the room, stopping precisely 10 feet from the elevated stage. Ozo Emina stepped forward. He did not ask for a microphone. He pulled a silver pen from his robe and tapped it sharply against a nearby crystal water pitcher. The sharp times, clink times cut through the rising murmurs. And then, the first wave of the shockwave hit. Environmental silence. The string quartet, which had just begun to softly tune their instruments for the next movement, froze. A waiter carrying a tray of empty champagne flutes stopped dead in his tracks between 2 tables, holding his breath as if any sudden movement might trigger an explosion. The clinking of silverware vanished. The quiet hum of the air conditioning suddenly sounded like a roaring engine. The room went completely, absolutely dead. It was not the silence of anticipation. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a room that had just realized it was trapped inside a cage with a predator. The heavy, suffocating silence of the Grand Kilimanjaro Hotel ballroom stretched into an eternity. It was a physical weight, pressing against the eardrums of every billionaire, investor, and politician in the room. The only sound was the low, mechanical hum of the industrial air conditioning and the frantic, shallow breathing of the man standing at the acrylic podium. Sylvester stared down at the center aisle, his brain violently rejecting the visual information it was receiving. The woman standing before him, draped in midnight blue and flanked by armed security, could not be his wife. His wife was a destitute orphan, a pathetic creature he had left locked in the estate's laundry room to pack her meager belongings. But the absolute authority radiating from Zubaida's posture and the terrifying presence of the Zenith Global Adjudicator beside her dismantled his reality piece by piece. Ozo Emina stepped forward, entirely unaffected by the shockwave he had just unleashed upon the room. He did not yell. He did not need to. He unfolded the heavy black leather folio, the crisp sound of the thick paper cutting through the dead air like a scalpel. "Sylvester," Ozo Emina said, his voice carrying the calm, detached tone of a surgeon about to amputate a necrotic limb, step away from the podium. Sylvester blinked, his fingers tightening reflexively around the microphone. The edges of his vision began to blur. "Ozo Emina?" he stammered, his heavily amplified voice cracking, completely stripped of its former golden resonance. "What is the meaning of this? Who authorized her entry?" "Security, remove this woman. My wife is a beggar." "Your wife?" Ozo Emina corrected gently, his words amplified by the absolute stillness of the room, "is Zubaida Obiora, the sole living heir to the Obiora Trust. the majority shareholder of Zenith Global Industries, and the legal owner of the shoes currently on your feet. By executive mandate, she has terminated your employment, seized your assets, and voided your security clearance. You are trespassing at her corporate function. The words did not just land, they detonated. The color drained from Sylvester's face, the way light leaves a room when the main power cable is severed with an axe. Not gradually, but all at once. The deep, rich brown of his skin turned a sickly, ashen gray. His jaw fell slack, his mouth opening, but his vocal cords completely paralyzed. The heavy microphone slipped from his trembling fingers. It struck the carpeted stage with a dull, heavy thud, followed by a sharp burst of static feedback that made several guests flinch. He could not breathe. The room spun. Everything dissolved. His knees buckled slightly, his hands instinctively reaching out to grip the edges of the clear acrylic podium just to keep himself vertical. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, but his lungs refused to expand. He was experiencing a total cognitive collapse, his mind entirely unable to process the mathematics of his own ruin. He had spent his entire life building a fortress of arrogance, completely unaware that he had constructed it directly on top of a fault line she controlled. At the head table, the collateral damage was immediate. Bernice, the matriarch who had architected this fraudulent dynasty, tried to stand up from her gilded chair, but her legs, suddenly entirely devoid of strength, betrayed her. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the thick carpet. She retreated blindly until her spine collided violently with the cold marble of the ballroom wall. The heavy crystal champagne flute slipped from her perfectly manicured fingers. It hit the floor and shattered into 100 glittering, jagged pieces, the expensive French wine pooling around her feet like blood. The heavy, raw emeralds draped around her neck suddenly ceased to look like a display of extreme wealth. They looked exactly like a brightly colored noose, pulling her down under the weight of her own hubris. The loyalty of the elite is entirely conditional, a truth Vivian and her father understood intimately. The shipping magnate did not wait for an explanation. He did not demand an apology. He saw a sinking ship, and his survival instincts were ruthless. He stood up abruptly, kicking his chair back. He grabbed his daughter roughly by the upper arm, ignoring her gasp of shock. As he pulled her away from the table, the hem of Vivian's scarlet silk dress caught on the jagged edge of the shattered champagne flute. The expensive fabric tore with a loud, distinct hiss, a sound that perfectly summarized the death of the merger. They walked briskly toward the side exit, severing their ties to Sylvester without offering him a single backward glance. Through the chaos, the murmurs, and the absolute destruction of the Eaglecrest dynasty, Zubaida did not move. She stood at the base of the stage in a state of glacial stillness. She did not smile. She did not cross her arms in triumph. She did not offer a speech of vindication. Her expression was an empty room, completely devoid of the rage or sorrow they had expected from her for 7 months. To be hated is a form of recognition, but to be looked at with absolute, cold indifference is a total psychological erasure. She watched Sylvester hyperventilate on the stage, observing his panic with the sterile detachment of a scientist watching a chemical reaction conclude. Sylvester's eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for an ally, a security guard, anyone who would validate his authority. But the room belonged to her. He looked down at the woman he had locked in a freezing elevator, the woman whose mother's memory he had torn to shreds, and finally understood the catastrophic scale of his error. He swallowed hard, a painful, dry sound. "Zubaida?" he whispered, his voice small, pathetic, and entirely broken. You planned this? All of it?" Zubaida looked up at him. Her breathing was slow, deep, and perfectly unbroken. "That is what I expected you to say," she replied quietly. Ozo Emina raised a hand, signaling the tactical security contractors. The 4 men moved with terrifying efficiency. They ascended the steps to the stage, flanking Sylvester. There was no negotiation. There was no grace period. Hand over your company access cards, your corporate-issued mobile device, and the biometric keys to the Eagle Crest estate, the lead contractor demanded, his hand resting firmly on the handle of his baton. Sylvester's hands shook uncontrollably as he reached into the pockets of his tailored tuxedo. He pulled out the black titanium cards and the heavy key fob, the physical manifestations of his stolen identity, and dropped them into the contractor's open palm. The exchange took less than 5 seconds, but it stripped him of a lifetime of ill-gotten prestige. Escort them to the service exit, Ozoemena instructed, not looking at Sylvester, but addressing the guards. They are no longer permitted on Zenith Global properties. If they resist, involve the municipal police. The walk from the center of the grand ballroom to the heavy double doors was the longest, most agonizing journey of Sylvester's life. The crowd of billionaires and investors, the very people he had tried to impress hours earlier, parted like the Red Sea, pulling their expensive coats and dresses away to avoid touching him. Bernice followed behind him, weeping silently, her mascara running down her face in dark, ugly rivers, entirely ignoring the shards of glass crunching beneath her shoes. They were pushed out of the heavy service doors and into the suffocating, humid night of Dar es Salaam. There was no tinted luxury vehicle waiting for them. There was no driver rushing to open their doors. The heavy metal doors of the Kilimanjaro Hotel slammed shut behind them with a definitive, ringing finality. Sylvester stepped onto the gritty, uneven pavement, the smell of vehicle exhaust and rotting fruit from the nearby alley filling his lungs. He looked down at his empty hands. He had spent 7 months telling Zubaida she was a ghost taking up space in his house, entirely unaware that he was the one haunting a life that never belonged to him. And now, the true owner had finally turned on the lights. The heavy, reinforced service doors of the Grand Kilimanjaro Hotel slammed shut with a metallic finality that echoed down the narrow, dimly lit alleyway. The automatic deadbolts engaged with a sharp, heavy click, definitively locking Sylvester and Bernice out of the insulated, temperature-controlled kingdom they had ruled mere minutes ago. They stood on the cracked, uneven pavement of the Dar es Salaam street, instantly swallowed by the suffocating, unforgiving humidity of the coastal night. The air out here was not scented with fresh orchids and imported French cologne. It was thick and aggressive, smelling fiercely of idling diesel engines, rotting mangoes from a nearby dumpster, and the heavy, metallic tang of the Indian Ocean. For the first time in his adult life, Sylvester's bespoke Italian leather shoes sank slightly into a puddle of stagnant, oily street water. He looked up and down the chaotic avenue. There was no tinted luxury vehicle idling at the curb. There was no driver rushing forward with a terrified apology to open his door. There was no estate to return to, no corporate account to draw from, and no security detail to shield him from the eyes of the ordinary citizens who were now staring at his ruined tuxedo. Beside him, Bernice leaned heavily against the damp brick wall of the alley, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The spun gold fabric of her expensive designer gown was already collecting soot from the pavement. The heavy raw emeralds draped around her neck, which had sparkled so violently under the chandeliers, now felt like stones tied to the neck of a drowning woman. She had meticulously orchestrated this marriage, intentionally seeking out an orphan with no family, no wealth, and no voice, believing she was securing a perfectly submissive decoration for her son. She had actively built a house of cards on a foundation of extreme cruelty, completely blind to the fact that the woman she had chosen to be the floor mat was actually the architect of the entire building. The realization hit her with the physical force of a falling brick. The poverty she had so casually mocked had never been Zubaida's reality. It had merely been the uniform of her executioner. Far above the filth and noise of the street, suspended in the quiet sanctuary of the 42nd floor, Zubaida stepped out onto the expansive glass balcony of the Zenith Global Executive Suite. The wind at this altitude was sharp and clean, pulling at the lapels of her midnight blue suit and cooling the skin of her face. Below her, the sprawling metropolis of Dar es Salaam stretched out into the darkness, its millions of streetlights glittering like a vast ocean of scattered diamonds. She looked down toward the microscopic figures moving along the pavement, though she could not distinguish her former husband among them. She did not need to. The physical tightness in her throat, the invisible, suffocating hand that had gripped her vocal cords for 7 excruciating months, was entirely gone. Her chest rose and fell in a deep, unobstructed rhythm. She did not feel the sudden, giddy rush of adrenaline that fools often mistake for victory. What she felt was a profound, absolute, and terrifying stillness. Sylvester had spent his entire life believing that true power was loud. He had equated authority with the volume of a man's voice, the heavy sound of a fist slamming onto a mahogany desk, and the ability to inflict physical and emotional trauma without consequence. He had believed that by tearing the pages of her mother's poetry book, by forcing her to wear the bleach-scented uniform of a maid, and by locking her in a freezing elevator, he was proving his superiority. But he was fundamentally mistaken about the nature of strength. Arrogance is fragile because it requires constant, loud validation from the outside world. Patience, however, is a self-sustaining weapon. Zubaida had never needed to raise her voice, because the truth does not require a microphone to be devastating. True power is silent. It is the quiet hum of a wire transfer moving millions of dollars in the dark. It is the scratch of a fountain pen on watermarked paper. It is the terrifying ability to endure the fire without ever turning to ash. Sylvester had tried to bury her under the weight of his own hubris, entirely forgetting that seeds only grow when they are pushed into the dirt. He had thought he was hollowing her out, but she had merely been making room to store the evidence of his ruin. The universe has a specific, inescapable rhythm. A man who builds his kingdom on the humiliation of others will eventually discover that his throne is constructed of dry wood, and time is a highly patient spark. The truth is like water. No matter how high or how thick the dam of lies is built, given enough time, the water will always find the microscopic crack, and it will tear the entire structure apart. If this story reached you, share it with one woman in your life who needs to hear it. Not for me, for her. Because every woman you know is carrying a story she has never told. And somewhere in this one, maybe you heard the beginning of hers. Subscribe only if you intend to stay. This channel is not for passing traffic. It is for women who know that patience is a weapon, silence is a strategy, and the truth, given enough time, always finds the door.